Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited too. Before I start with the presentation, give you a short sentence to introduce our topic: a world in which a single software platform can serve multiple companies simultaneously, a world where the boundaries between users blur and resources are intelligently shared. Welcome to our lecture about the topic Real-Life SaaS with SAP CAP. My name is Niklas Ullrich, and this is my colleague Marius Bertsch. We both are from Advades, and since 2002, our company has been focusing on creating innovative software solutions for digitalized companies under the heading Expertise for Next Generation SAP Technologies. In our current project, our objective is to develop a multi-tenant application that will allow us to serve multiple companies a single service and offer them an application that is completely isolated from each other. In line with this objective, we also need to implement a suitable authentication and authorization system to ensure that only authorized user can access his own isolated application. We also want to automate, that's our whole topic, to automate the entire onboarding and offboarding process in a separate application, so the process can be triggered by the user. Let's go through our agenda. At first, I'll give you an overview of the multi-tenancy architecture on BTP. After that, we will give you a detailed process scenario of the customer onboarding process, and then a little bit practice with a live demo about the API request, which we called. And at last, I show you how to implement third-party identity provider. At the beginning, I give you an overview of the BTP with the various sub-accounts and modules and resources which we need for the multi-tenancy application. Here on the BTP, we have one provider sub-account where the multi-tenancy application and the admin app where we automate the onboarding process are hosted, and we have several consumer sub-accounts which are directly created in a directory because we want that they inherit the cloud management service entitlement. If we didn't do that, we have to call further requests to create the entitlement in each consumer sub-account. So that's the easier way to inherit that from the directory. Now let's go to the modules part. Here, modules are services or applications created by yourself. In our case, we have a simple SAP UI5 app, which is based on a Node.js backend service. I think you are all familiar with that. And we also have a service broker, which enables us to create our own services. Here we create an own API service, which we create to access the data of individual tenants in each consumer sub-account. And for your knowledge, in multi-tenancy environment, each consumer sub-account gets its own instance of that API service to get an access to data. Now we come to the resources part. Resources are services provided by SAP. For our multi-tenancy application, we need two authentication services, one to authorize the SAP UI5 app and one to authorize the API service for each consumer sub-account. And to the service manager and provisioning server, I come after that. We have at last the destination service and credential store for the admin app where we automate the onboarding process. The destination service provides us various destination. One destination we need to call the account service to create the sub-accounts. And the other destination is to call the Cloud Foundry API for the route management, to create the routes or delete the routes. And in the destination, we have an authorization implemented, so when you call the destination, you are directly authorized. And last, we have the credential store, where you store the credentials, the name called it, like the client ID or client secret, so you don't have to hard code it in the backend. Yes. Now we go to the subscription part. The service manager and provisioning service are also provided, hosted in the provider sub account. And we also have the SAP HANA Cloud as a database. And the service manager serves as a central registry for the service broker to creation your API instance. And it provides a metadata database to store all the tenants. And if the subscription process is triggered, the service manager creates a dedicated HCI container for each consumer sub-account, so the database are isolated from the other one. At last, we have the provisioning service where the multi-tenancy application is registered. And if the provisioning subscription process is triggered, the provisioning service provides each consumer sub-account an instance of that multi-tenancy application, so the front end and the database are isolated. So now we go to the practical part.
Thank you very much, Anita. Can you hear me? All right, thank you. I'm now going to show you how we onboard new consumer if they want to use our project. We onboard new consumer on the BTP through a chain of API requests, which are all here in the documentation on the API sap.com, which are very nice, so you don't have to manually click everything on the BTP, so you can just call the API. And as you can see here in the upper half is how to make an authorized call through the API endpoint. So you can call store the credentials you need in a destination on the BTP. So you just have to call the destination and it automatically authorizes you with, for example, here client ID, client secret, and the username password. So you can make a call on, for example, here the account service, which returns the thing you need. Or if you can't make a destination, you have to use the binding to call the authentication endpoint, which is stored in the service key in the binding, as you see down here, the URL. And then with client ID, client secret, for example, you get a bearer token in return. And with the token, you can call the API endpoint. In this example here, also the account service. So keeping that in mind, I show you now the process on how to onboard a new consumer on the BTP, which you can, we need to do 4 major things, which are highlighted in the middle, which is we have to create a new sub-account for the consumer. Then we have to subscribe our project, our application on that newly created sub-account. Then we have to create a route and map it to the original application on the provider tenant. And we also have an API service binding, which gives you the access from third-party applications to have access on the database. There are some intermediate steps you need to do to create all those 4 things, which are all done by API calls to the BTP API hub. So firstly, you create a sub-account through the account service API. But for the subscription, you need the credentials, which are stored in the cloud management service binding. But the cloud management service instance to create that, you need the service management binding, which you do through the account service. I hope you can see it. I think it's a bit cut up here. Here's a line that goes up here. So you firstly you create the service management binding. So you can now create the cloud management binding through the service manager API to gain the credentials to call the SaaS provisioning service API, which then creates the subscription. And after that, you can create the route and the route destination through the Cloud Foundry API, which returns an URL to your created application on the consumer tenant, which you can then access. And for the API service binding, you need a service broker, which you also create to the service manager API, which gives you then the credentials like the authentication URL, the API URL, client ID, client secret, which you need to call your data. So now I'm going to show you quickly in a little small admin application, which I hope I have started it. No. Which is just there to takes a while. It's finally. Try something else. All right, I don't know. Just a small application to trigger the onboarding and offboarding. As you can see here, we have two sub-accounts. The first is the provider tenant, and I have already created another consumer tenant, C1, which I have created before, so you don't have to see me take the credentials to our third-party application, which you see in a minute. So now we can just give it a name and trigger the onboarding process, which we switch here. On the console log, you now see it starts creating the sub-account, which takes a while. So we have to ask every 4 to 5 seconds in what state it is. Now it's in creating, and after a while it switches to OK. But I can show you it's just a simple here, just a simple HTTP request, which we use the SAP Cloud SDK HTTP client. In the case of creating a new sub-account, where we use a destination, there is stored all the credentials, so we don't have to do it here. This is some data. But for example, for the for the cloud management service, we need the bearer token from the service manager. So we first of all need to call the authentication URL from the service management binding. As you can see here in the URL, we get the auth token with the authorization with client ID, client secret, which then returns a bearer token. And with that bearer token, as you can see here, for creating the cloud management service, we just give it an authorization to get an authorized access to the API of the service manager. So now you can see here, he did everything I wanted. Sorry for the create a proxy rewrite. I hope you can see sub account, created the cloud management service binding, started application. So now we can switch to the BTP where I have to sign in. I forgot to do that. Nice. To go here. Oh, it's really big. But now you can see here, here are the provider tenant, another consumer tenant, and it has created the another consumer tenant C2, which we created together. And when I click on it, you can see it created 4 instances and subscription. Here's the application, which is a sample bookshop for the demo purpose. The cloud management service manager, which you need, and the bookshop API instance, where the binding is stored. And here are the client ID, client secret, which you need for the API access. So now when I give myself access in the role collection, simple. So now when I switch to the provider tenant, call it what is CF, go to the Cloud Foundry, to the routes. You see here for C2 that I created the route and mapped it to our bookshop app on the provider tenant. So now we can go ahead, click on it, and you see all the links. The original link, the link to the C1 tenant and to C2. So now when I click on it, we should be logged in to also just a simple application, but it works. So now I can show you the API instance, which I have already configured for the C1. I just use Postman, which is a simple way for demonstration, I think. Here you see, here you can see for C1, here's the authentication URL, client ID, client secret. So we get a bearer token, and then we just post some data through that application, which worked. So now we can switch. Here you can see one, it's still empty, but when I refresh and log in, there's the data we posted from the API. And obviously C2 is still empty because it's tenant separated. So now we have onboarded a new application and a API service for a new consumer. And now we have still some time for Niklas to show us how to implement IIS.
Thank you. Marius used the default identity provider, so only S user can access this application. But if we have multi-tenancy applications, so we want to serve that with customer who don't have S user ID, and then he have an Outlook account or Hotmail or what else. So we have to. Oh, this is not the right one. So you have to establish the trust. So you download the SAML metadata here on the consumer tenant, and you have to download the same on the IIS. Here you have to download it here. And now you can create a new trust configuration and copy the file from IIS and put it here, give it a short name, like a custom IIS. And now you have to configure 2 things. At first, you have to create a bundled application and put the access point from the front-end app. That's this one. And now you have to configure 2 things. One is to change the user ID to email, because we want to authorize with email in our case, and put the assertion attributes groups here in there, because we want to authorize with user group we created here. So you have to create a user group like bookshop user and assign me and Marius, because we want to authorize. and you have to put the SAML metadata from the consumer sub-account and to establish the trust, to put it here and save it. And the last one is to take the role collection and we delete the default here. And yeah, I prepared before. So here bookshop viewer and save it where you have the link here. Das mal schnell.
Yeah.
So now you can see we are authorized with third-party identity provider. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions.